Hello everyone, I'm Daniel and I'm going to present today about models of grounded cognition. Now, I'm going to start with a motivation in which I first explain what grounded cognition is. What grounded cognition is perhaps best understood if it is contrasted with an opposing view that was quite widespread in the cognitive sciences for many decades in the last century and still has many proponents today. And that view is often referred to as amodal symbol systems. According to this view, the higher cognitive competences, which include things like language, reasoning, planning, or problem solving, can best be explained as the algorithmic processing of abstract symbols. So the idea is that the perceptual or motor states which underlie the more like low-level cognitive functions that we've seen so far are transduced into a non-perceptual or amodal representational language. So amodal here means that it's a symbolic language where the symbols bear no relationship to the actual perceptual or motor states that gave rise to them. And the idea then is that the higher cognitive functions are best modeled as algorithms which operate on these symbolic representations. Now, in the last few decades, it's been increasingly recognized that this view is highly problematic. It's not at all a realistic view of how the brain operates. For instance, there's no direct empirical evidence that amodal symbols exist in the brain. What we find instead is that the higher cognitive tasks seem to be grounded in the sensory motor regions of the brain. So, for example, fMRI studies or lesion studies suggest that the same brain regions which are involved in the perception of certain object classes or in the motor interaction with certain object classes are also involved in conceptual reasoning about those same object classes. So, for example, I might have a region in my brain which I use to identify chairs or visually search for chairs. And the grounded cognition hypothesis is that I use those same brain regions when I solve some abstract reasoning problems about chairs. Another problem is that these amodal symbol systems are inconsistent with neural principles of computation. So the algorithmic models often feature things like function calls, random access memories, stacks, and so forth, all of which are computer science concepts that bear no relationship, or rather that are unlikely to be realized by the neural hardware of the brain. In response, views of grounded cognition emphasize that cognition is inherently perceptual. This means that there's no qualitative division between cognitive processes at the sensory motor level and so-called higher cognitive processes. In other words, there's no such thing as higher cognitive processes distinct from the processes at the perceptual level. What we find instead is that the higher cognitive competences rely on perceptual or motor simulations. So the idea is that during interaction with the world, we learn about object categories, and what we learn is how we perceived them when they were actually around us, or how we interacted with them. And we use this knowledge to simulate what it is like to perceive such objects or interact with them in order to solve higher cognitive tasks. So for example, when somebody describes some scene which involves a chair and we want to make sense of what happens, we do so by reactivating the perceptual and motor representations that we use when we perceive or interact with chairs. Furthermore, analysis of language reveals that many of our abstract concepts are metaphorically related to more basic concepts. So for example, a widespread metaphor in our culture is that happy is up and sad is down. And this is not just a wordplay, it's really, there's an underlying reality to it, in the sense that we make sense of these abstract concepts, happy and sad, by virtue of the spatial metaphors. And this may lead to the conjecture that most, or maybe even all of our concepts may be grounded in primitive perceptual, motor, or spatial concepts. One study in this regard is particularly noteworthy because it directly pertains to one of the models that I'm about to present. And that study, conducted by Ragni and Knauf, demonstrates that human reasoning relies on building spatial layout models. So what does that mean? If we're given a reasoning task, like for example, we provide a set of premises, and then we want to verify whether the conclusion is true. So in this example, the premises might be the Porsche is parked to the left of the Dodge, and the Ferrari is parked to the right of the Dodge. Then participants were asked to verify whether it's true that therefore the Dodge is parked to the left of the Ferrari. Classically, it's been assumed that humans solve such tasks by embedding the premises in some sort of predicate calculus and conducting a logical proof in order to verify whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises. But what this study and other studies have shown is that that's not at all how human beings go about solving this task. What they do instead is that they build a so-called spatial layout model that's in accordance with the premises. So when they encounter the first premise, the Porsche is parked to the left of the Dodge, what they do is they draw a Porsche and a Dodge on a spatial canvas such that the Porsche is in fact to the left of the Dodge in that continuous spatial representation. And then upon encountering the next premise, the Ferrari is parked to the right of the Dodge, they extend the previously built spatial layout model such that the Ferrari is in fact to the right of the Dodge that was already part of the model. And then in order to verify whether the Dodge is in fact parked to the left of the Ferrari, they just read off this result from that spatial layout model. So they just check whether the Dodge in their spatial layout model is in fact to the left of the Ferrari. And this model can not only account for spatial reasoning tasks, but it can even account for abstract reasoning tasks. So when given premises like Willy Brandt was more popular than Gerhard Schröder was, and Gerhard Schröder was more popular than Angela Merkel is, we can draw the conclusion that therefore Willy Brandt was more popular than Angela Merkel is. And we can account for how human beings do this, again, by spatial layout models. This time they are not defined over actual physical space, but rather over some abstract degree of popularity space. But still, human beings seem to embed the described people or entities into a spatial layout model in such a way that since Brandt was more popular than Schröder, he's to the left of Schröder in this spatial layout model. And since Schröder was more popular than Angela Merkel, he's to the left of Merkel in that spatial layout model. And then again, people draw the conclusion that Willy Brandt was more popular than Angela Merkel is simply by reading off that Willy Brandt is to the left of Merkel in this spatial layout model. And such studies may lead to the conjecture that models of perceptual, motor, and spatial cognition may be used to explain much, if not all, of higher cognition. So now I'm going to go about presenting DFT models of grounded cognition. In the following, I will use the term spatial language to refer to language which involves terms that stand for spatial relational concepts. An example would be the green object, which is to the left of the red object. Or another example is the green object, which is moving toward the red object. And any phrase of this kind that contains spatial relationships like in front of, inside, bigger than, above, etc., would count as spatial language under this definition. Now, the first task that we're going to solve is to compare two objects with respect to their spatial relation. So for example, we might ask the model, where's the green object relative to the red object? And when given this visual stimulus as input, we want it to respond to the right, because the green object is in fact to the right of the red object. In order to solve these tasks, we need to do three things. First, we need to find objects of the appropriate colors in the perceptual input. In the following, I will refer to the object whose relation we're asking about as the target of that relation, and I will refer to the object in relation to which we want to know the target's location as the reference. So in the example question, where's the green object relative to the red object? The green object would be our target object since we're asking about its location, and the red object would be the reference object because we are asking where is the green object relative to that red reference object. Having found those objects in the perceptual input, we next need to perform a coordinate transformation in order to get the position of the target object relative to the reference object. So in other words, we have to transform the location of the green object into a coordinate system that is centered on the reference object in such a way that we can see where the green object is relative to the green object. And finally, we need to compare that relative position to relational templates for discrete relation categories. So for example, is it above, is it to the left, or etc. And we're now going to go through each of these three things in turn. So finding objects in the perceptual input works exactly as you've seen numerous times already. We have a color space field that is defined over the two spatial dimensions of the visual input and an additional color dimensions. Here we see two-dimensional slices for the three colors, red, green, and blue. And we can see that the red object has a peak in the red region, the green object in the green region, etc. Or rather, it's not a peak, but it's a sub-threshold bump of activation. In order to search for objects, we introduce color concept nodes, which project into the respective regions of the field, so that when they are activated, they provide a rich input into that region, and thereby cause a peak to form on the location of objects with the activated color. So in this case, when we activate the green node, we cause it to form a peak on the location of the green object. Now, in order to be able to compare the target object to the reference object with respect to its spatial relation, we have to store the location of both the target object and the reference object in a working memory. And for this, we introduce two fields, the target field and the reference field. And then we first search for one of the two objects, for example, the target object, and simultaneously boost this field in order to store its position there. And we do the same for the red reference object. So we activate the red node and we boost the reference field so that the location of the red object is stored in the reference field. So now that we have stored the position of the target and reference in the respective fields, so as you can see, the green object is now stored in the target field and the red object is stored in the reference field, we want to determine the relative location of the target object with respect to the reference object. In order to do this, we perform a coordinate transformation, which works the same way as has been introduced by Professor Schöner in the higher cognition lecture, with a transformation field and a diagonal readout. And the result feeds into an object-centered field. So in effect, that object-centered field then forms a peak on the location of the target object in a coordinate system that is centered on the reference object. Now, since this is the reference object, we find that the green object is to the right of it, so the relative location is somewhere to the right of the center here in this relative coordinate system. Next, we want to compare this relative location to spatial templates for the various spatial relation categories. And for this purpose, we introduce a set of spatial relation concept nodes, which receive input from all the locations of the object-centered field. But that input is not homogeneous across the entire field. For each of the color concepts, we use synaptic weight patterns, which correspond to the to the spatial relational template that's depicted here. So in the case of right, we have synaptic weights which are such that locations which are to the right of the center have a higher synaptic weight, so they project more activation into the right node than locations which aren't to the right of the center. Like, for example, locations which are to the left project nothing at all, and locations which are a bit to the upper right, they project less than locations which are exactly to the right. So this pattern is really a Gaussian centered in polar coordinates, centered on the angular direction of the location of the spatial relation. So in the case of right, it points to the right. In the case of above, it points to the top, etc. Now, since this position is in fact to the right, we find that the right node has a high activation because the synaptic pattern matches the relative location well, whereas the other nodes have a rather low activation because this relative location doesn't fit their pattern so well. In order to now get the system to respond categorically, we want to turn that graded activation pattern into a selection decision. So we introduce another set of nodes which receive inputs from their respective spatial relation nodes, but they feature self-excitation and mutual inhibition, so that only one of them can win the competition and become active. And if we then boost these nodes, we get the system to trigger a response, which is the answer that the system gives to the original question: where's the green object relative to the red object? It's to the right. The next task that we're going to have a look at is target identification, in which we want to find an object which bears a given spatial relation to a given reference object. So, for example, we might ask, which object is above the blue object? So the reference object would be the blue object, and this time we already specify the spatial relation, it's above. But we now want to know where is the target object and what is its color. So the answer would be the red object is above the blue object. And we can solve that problem using the same architecture. The only new thing is that the coordinate transform is bidirectional. So all the connections in the coordinate transform are bidirectional, and therefore, in addition to the previous thing of projecting the target location into a coordinate system that's centered on the reference object, we can do a new thing, namely, we can project a relative location in the object-centered field back into the coordinate system of the visual input. And this way, for example, if we have a relative location which is above, and we have chosen a reference object, then we can cause the target field to receive input on those locations that are in fact above the reference object. And so in order to supply this relation and reference object, we again first store the reference object in the reference field by activating the blue node and boosting the reference field. And now we activate the spatial relation node for above, which has back projections to this, this group of nodes. And these nodes in turn project their spatial relational template into the object-centered field as before, only in the other direction. So the spatial relation concept nodes also have projections from that node to all the locations in this field, where again the synaptic weight correspond to the characteristic patterns of those spatial relations. And in effect, if, for example, we activate the above node, we cause a spatial above pattern to be fed into the object-centered field. And if we additionally boost that field, then we cause a peak to emerge, which is in fact above the center. And if that peak is then projected back through the coordinate transformation, as I just explained, it causes regions in the target field which are above the reference object to receive elevated subthreshold activation. So if we then boost that field, we cause a peak to emerge on the location of a target object, which is in fact above the reference object. And so this would be the location of the object, which is above the blue object, but we want a categorical response. So we also have backwards connections from the target field to the color space fields, which cause a peak to form on the red object in this field, in effect causing the red node to become active because the red region has a larger input. I'm going to skip this, and now we're going to have a look at a slightly different task, namely what we refer to as the grounding of a phrase, where we want to find the denoted object in the visual input. So for example, we might ask the red object, or find the red object which is to the left of the green object. Now, solving this task generally requires an extension of the previous model, because we might have ambiguous stimuli. So in this example here, we find that there are two green objects. So we cannot just select one of the green objects as before for the reference object, because we might turn out to select the wrong object. So if we accidentally have choose this as our green reference object, then we cannot find a red object which is to the left of that. And so we would have to reset the whole model to its initial state and try again. But what we want instead is an architecture where we only supply this phrase once in the beginning, and then the architecture unfolds completely autonomously until it generates a response, namely this is the red object which is to the left of a green object. And this requires an autonomous form of hypothesis testing, because in case this green object turns out to be the wrong reference object, we needed to undo that selection decision and select the other one instead. And here's a model which solves this task. It's been presented by Richter et al. 2014. So it's essentially an extension of the previous model by Lipinski et al. Again, we have spatial relation concept nodes, which are bidirectionally coupled to a relational field with the characteristic spatial relation patterns. We also have color concept nodes, but this time we have two groups of color concept nodes, one for the reference role and one for the target role. And within each group, we have color memory nodes and color production nodes. And that is because supplying a certain color as the reference color shouldn't immediately lead the model to start searching for that object, because the target color is presented at the same time, or rather these nodes are active simultaneously. We want the system to remember that the color of the reference object is green and the color of the target object is red. And in order to achieve this, we have self-sustained memory nodes, which get activated in the beginning when the linguistic input is supplied. So the user activates the green reference node and the red target node, and these nodes remain active, but they don't yet have an effect on the color search process, because for one, they cannot both be searched for at the same time. So we need a process organization system which makes sure that that only one of them is searched for at a time. And we will have a look at that in a few minutes. Now, the color search mechanism doesn't directly project from the color production nodes to the color space perception field, because this does not allow us to detect whether the object of that color was successfully found. So in order to be able to detect that, we introduce three fields. First, a color intention field is one-dimensional and defined over the hue dimension of the color space. And a peak in that field reflects that the system now intends to search for an object of the color at which location there is a peak. So there are projections from the color production nodes, like these purple ones here and here, into the color intention field, which correspond to a Gaussian that's centered on the prototypical color value for that color category. And upon activation, these nodes does cause a peak to form at that location. And the intention field in turn projects into the color space perception field along that hue dimension, creating a rich input there, which, as you've seen before, causes visual search to be triggered for the objects of that color. Now, in order to determine whether an object of the intended color has in fact been found in the perception field, we introduce a condition of satisfaction field. That field is again one-dimensional, and it receives input from the color intention field, creating a subthreshold bump on the color that we want to find. And it also receives subthreshold input from the perception field corresponding to the color of the object that has in fact been found. And only if these two inputs overlap, the condition of satisfaction field forms a peak. So this means that the field forms a peak whenever an object of the intended color has in fact been found in the perceptual field. We also want to detect the failure of the search, and for this purpose we introduce a condition of dissatisfaction field. That field receives inhibitory input from the color intention field and an excitatory input from the perceptual field. In effect, it forms a peak whenever the intended color, the color we wanted to find, does not match whatever color it is that we have found in the perceptual field. And thus a peak in this system, in this field, means that no object of the desired color could be found, and this can be used as feedback to the process organization system in order to trigger a failure response. Now, as before, we have a reference field and the target candidates field. So this time the target candidates field can allow for multiple peaks because we want to be able to deal with situations where there are multiple objects with the same color and we want to select a single one. We also introduce a single peak target response field, which serves to highlight or signal the ultimate decision that was made, which of the candidates is the correct object that we were looking for. What's new and maybe most important about this architecture is that we introduce a so-called inhibition of return field. That field receives excitatory input from the reference field and projects inhibitory input back into that field. The purpose of this is that if, as you've seen in the example with the cups, we choose a wrong reference object initially, we want that field to remember this wrong selection decision by forming a self-sustained peak at that location. And then if through the condition of dissatisfaction fields, we find out that certain search was not successful, we can delete the reference object from this field, causing the system to select a new reference object. And when this happens, we don't want it to select the same reference object again. And this is achieved by having the inhibition of return field inhibit that location so that it does not get selected again. As before, we have a relational condition of satisfaction field, which receives input from the from a coordinate transform, thereby forming subthreshold bumps on the relative locations of the target candidates in a coordinate system that's centered on the reference object. And it also receives spatial relational templates from the spatial relation concept nodes. And when these overlap, the field forms a peak on those target candidates that are in fact in the given spatial relation to the reference object. What's new here is that we also introduce a relational condition of dissatisfaction field, which serves the purpose of detecting if no target candidate exists that stands in the given spatial relation to the reference object. And this can be detected by again projecting the relative locations of the target candidates into this field. But instead of the spatial relation template, we now feed an inverse spatial relation template into that field, which corresponds to the one minus the synaptic weights of the actual pattern, so that wrong locations, which are not in this example to the right, cause peaks to form in that field, whereas correct locations, which are in fact to the right, do not form peaks. And this way, when a peak forms in the condition of dissatisfaction field, this means that no such target candidate could be found. And this again can be used as a feedback to the process organization system to detect the case that that the wrong selection decision has been made, and to re-trigger the search for a new reference object in order to find the correct one. Now, all of this is driven home when we now look at the process organization system. There are 3 processes, and each of them is comprised of 2 nodes. I guess you've learned about this already. So each process has an intention node, which determines the effect that the process has on the architecture, and a condition of satisfaction node, which gets activated when that process has successfully finished. The reference process serves the purpose of finding the reference object, and it achieves this by 2 projections. So the intention node first just provides boost input to the reference field, thereby enabling it to form a peak. It also provides boost input into the color production nodes for the reference object. So in effect, if we have provided a certain color in the memory node, for example, green here, and we activate the reference process, then we cause the green color production node here to become active because it receives 2 inputs. And in effect, this causes that node to create a peak in the color intention field in the green region, so that a search for a green object in the visual input is triggered. And if that search was successful, a peak forms in the reference field, and that peak signals that a reference object of that color could in fact be found, and therefore the reference field projects to the condition of satisfaction node of the reference process, thereby signaling that the reference process has successfully finished and inhibiting the intention node so that this process no longer exerts an influence on the architecture. Sorry, I have to drink something. The target process does the completely analogous thing for the target, for selecting the target candidates. So again, the intention node projects into these target color production nodes, which gate the influence of the target color memory nodes onto the color intention field, and thereby cause a search for the target color to be triggered. And it also provides excitatory input to the target candidates field, allowing peaks to emerge there. And effectively, therefore, if objects of the desired color could be found, then peaks on the locations of those objects emerge in the target candidates field. And these peaks cause the condition of satisfaction node to become activated. And this signals that the target process has successfully finished, and it's also inhibited to stop it from exerting an influence on the architecture. Now, as you might have noticed, we have 2 conflicting color search processes. One of them is for looking for the reference color, and one of them is looking for the target color. And we cannot look for both colors at the same time. So in order to avoid that these processes become active at the same time, we introduce a precondition node, which inhibits the intention node of the target process, thereby preventing it from becoming active. But when the reference process has successfully finished, its condition of satisfaction node releases this inhibition and thereby allows the target process to become active. The last process is the spatial turn process, and that process gates the influence of the spatial relation patterns onto the relational fields down here, and it also boosts those fields to allow them to form peaks. And one last thing, there's another coordinate transform which transforms the relative locations of the target candidates that match the relational template back into the coordinate system of the visual input and projects into the target response field. So if we have found a pairing then of a reference object and a target object such that the target object is in the given spatial relation to the reference object, then we form a peak on that object in the target response field. Let me quickly check how much time we have. Okay, so we're like 10 more minutes and then the question round should start maybe. So let's have a look at a simulation of this architecture. So again, the input stimulus is this cup image here. We have two green objects, two red objects, and we are looking for a red object which is to the left of a green object. And here we see the time course of activation of the fields of the architecture at discrete moments in time across the columns, and the rows stand for different fields. So in the beginning, the reference process becomes active, causing a search for the green for a green object to be triggered and boosting the reference field so that one of them is selected in the reference field. Now, as we can see, it selects the wrong reference object, namely this green one here, but it doesn't know this yet. It only can later determine this if the search for a red target to the left of that green reference object fails. In the next time step, or rather at the next point in time, the target process has become active, calling the two red target candidates to be stored in the target candidates field. And also, meanwhile, the spatial turn process has become active in parallel, causing the left pattern to be fed into the relational field. Now, since none of those two red target candidates are in fact to the left of the selected green reference object, the relational field does not form a peak, but instead these relative positions match the inverse spatial relational template because they are precisely not to the left, and therefore the relational condition of dissatisfaction forms a peak, causing the original reference object selection decision to be undone by inhibiting the reference field and deleting this peak. As a result, the condition of satisfaction of the reference process becomes inactive again, causing the reference process to become active again. And again, analogously as before, it selects a green reference object, and due to the inhibition of return, this time it selects the other green object. Then in the next point in time, the target process has become active again. It again selected the two red target candidates and compares them to a spatial template. And since this red object here, which is one of the target candidates, is in fact to the left of this green reference object, we find that the relational field forms a peak on the correct target, and that target is then output in the target response field. Okay, so let's now have a look at how we can use the same model in solving mental imagery tasks, like the ones we have seen in the study by Knauf et al.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes?
In the previous slide,
yeah.
Could it happen after inhibiting the reference that is incorrect? Could it happen that when the reference process arises again, the incorrect is selected again? Or is there, I mean...
No, it cannot happen because the inhibition of return field has remembered the location of the previously selected reference object. and it inhibits the reference field so that this time another selection decision is made.
Yeah, okay.
And this generalizes to an arbitrary number of objects. The inhibition of return field just over time collects the locations of all the objects that have been tried before. So this works for an arbitrary number of objects, essentially.
Yeah, thanks.
So in mental imagery tasks, we want the model to imagine a described arrangement of objects. So there's no visual input. We just provide the linguistic phrases as input. For example, there's a cyan object above a green object, and we want the model to autonomously generate a mental model of the described premises in a scene representation field. So here it would just create a green object and a cyan object in some color space field in such a way that the cyan object is in fact above the green object. And as more premises are supplied, it should extend that model gradually. So when the next premise is there's a red object to the left of the green object, we want it to search for the green object inside the already established scene representation and extend it by adding a new object. And the model to achieve this is almost identical to the previous model. There are just a few extensions that I will now go through. So the first one is that we now have a scene representation field which comprises the model, that mental model, or like the representation that I've just explained, that the model has autonomously built. So peaks in this field mean that it has here, for example, placed a red object at this location, and here it has placed a green object at that location, and so forth. We have an attention field, which is essentially identical to the color space field from the previous model, in that it allows to search for objects in the scene representation. So it receives input from the scene representation, and through the same color search mechanism allows to search in there. Now, what's new is that we need a way to create new peaks in the scene representation. And the way we achieve this is by having a backwards projection from the attention field to the scene representation field, so that whatever peak it is that we might create in the attention field is then stored in the scene representation field. So if we want to add a yellow object at that location, we induce a peak in the attention field here, and through the excitatory projections to the scene representation field, it causes the peak to be stored there. Now there's also a projection from the target field to the attention field in order to supply the location of the new object that should be created. So if, for example, we want to create a new target object which is to the left of this reference object, then we just have to induce a peak in the target field which does in fact stand in the given spatial relation to the reference object, which we can do in the same way as we've seen in the Lipinski et al. Model. And that peak is then projected into the attention field, providing a rich input along the location. And this rich input coincides with another rich input from the color attention field, thereby providing the color of the target object. And we have the completely analogous thing for the reference field. So when a new reference object is created, we achieve this by inducing a peak here, which is then also stored in the scene representation field. We again have the same coordinate transformations as before that run in all directions, which allow searching in an already established model. Now this third coordinate transform also has the role of allowing the creation of new target objects. So it receives input from the reference field and the relational field, thereby projecting peaks in the relational field, which are in relative coordinates, back into absolute coordinates and projecting those in the target field. So then in order to create a new target object, which is to the left of this reference object, we provide the left spatial relation pattern to the relational field and boost that field so that a peak emerges there. And that peak is then transformed back into absolute coordinates and creates a peak here in the target field on the absolute location of the new target. And this way we can create new targets that stand in a given relation to an already existing object. One more thing to note is that the first object is not described by a relation. It's just placed in the middle of the canvas by providing a local excitatory input to the middle. And this is another coordinate transform which ensures that whatever new peak is created in the relational field does not occupy a position which is already occupied by an already existing object. So this is this accounts for the fact that human beings do not, when they add a new object to a mental model, they do not interfere with the already existing model, but rather they leave the existing model intact and place the new object outside of the existing model. So this is achieved then by projecting the locations of all the objects that are already in the model into a 2D field and transforming those locations into relative coordinates, which then inhibit the relational field at those locations, thereby preventing them from forming a peak there. Now, this is now probably best understood by, again, looking at an example. So the first premise that we supply here is there's a cyan object which is above a green object. And initially the reference process became active again, causing a green reference object to be placed in the center of the reference field. And subsequently the target object, the target process became active, which causes first to project the spatial relation pattern into the relational field, causing a peak to emerge at a relative location which is above the center. And that relative location is then transformed back into absolute coordinates and projected into the target field. And therefore, the target field forms a peak on a new location of a target object that is above the green reference object. And both the reference field and the target field feed into the attention field, and from there in the scene representation field, and that is how they are stored in the scene representation. So now we have successfully created a model where a cyan object is above a green object. The next point in time, we supply the premise there's a red object which is to the left of the green object. Now this time we get the reference object from the already existing scene representation. So we search for a green reference object there using the same means as before, causing that object to be stored in the reference field. And again, we supply the left template to the relational field, causing a peak to emerge on a relative location which is to the left of the center, which is again transformed into absolute coordinates in the target field. And for this reason, it's added to the scene representation. So now we have successfully created a new red object in that scene representation, which is to the left of the green object. The next case is a bit more interesting. So the premise is that the blue object is to the right of the red object. And what you can see if you have a look at the already created scene representation is that the location which is immediately to the right of the red object is already occupied. So what human beings do in this case, as I said already, is they place that object outside of the existing scene representation at a new location, which is to the right of both the red object and all other objects that are in somewhere in the middle. And so again, the red object is searched for and stored in the reference field. Then the right spatial relation pattern is projected into the reference field. And as you can see at these blue bumps here, the already occupied locations are inhibited here so that no peak can form at those locations. And as we can see at point in time later, a peak has formed on an unoccupied location, signaling the relative location where a new target object should be created, namely to the right of the center, which is again projected back into absolute coordinates in the target field and stored in the mental model. Okay, so it's now 6. I would say we stop it here, and I'm happy to take your questions.
So I do have a question. Have you tried, because this was a visual representation of objects, but you started the talk with mentioning more abstract symbols, for example. So have you experimented with that? Like, for example, I don't know if
I know what you
Sorry?
mean, yeah. So I know where the question is going. This is actually one of the goals of my PhD work, but as of now, we have nothing to show for it. But we're definitely going in this direction to actually demonstrate how abstract reasoning tasks can be solved using the same mechanism.
Okay, that's nice. So, for example, you could do some arithmetic with changing these colors for the symbols of numbers, and then you can do basic arithmetic operations, right?
Yes, that would be possible.
Okay.
But also other things like inferences in some abstract feature spaces, like degree of popularity, as we've seen in the example, or something like that. That should be possible. Actually, without change, we just interpret space as something different. We just rename the nodes to give them abstract concept names, but then the model would stay exactly the same and solve an abstract reasoning problem instead of a spatial reasoning problem.
Okay, nice. I might ask you more about it later.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you, too.
I have a follow-up question on that.
Yeah.
Is this abstract reasoning also maybe embedded in other spaces that are not related with the space?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So there is a large body of evidence reviewed by Professor of Philosophy Peter Gerdenfors. If you want to look that up, it's referred to as conceptual spaces, where he demonstrates that most of, or that a lot of the conceptual reasoning tasks can be given geometric interpretations. So he represents concepts as vectors is in some high-dimensional feature spaces, and he then demonstrates that abstract reasoning problems can be modeled by performing geometric manipulations of these vectors. And one of the frontiers where we're currently thinking about is how, or if we want to go in the direction of providing neural process accounts of the proposed operations. So if you're interested in having a look at how abstract concepts could be made sense of in geometric or spatial terms, have a look at the work of Peter Gerdenfors.